This is Disruption. Welcome to Disruption, everybody. I'm your host, Alex Sikma, joined by my commander in chuckles,
Stefan Walicord.
Today, our guest host, who I'll introduce in a second, has planned a fine episode for us today in which we step into the world of the pro-life movement, in particular, what is happening with the Protect Life Michigan. Have you ever wondered how the general public might be convinced of the pro-life position? Well, today we are going to be discussing that, how the PLM has conversations with people that might be kind of in between either the abortion side or the pro-life side. Maybe they're leaning a little bit on either side, but aren't really fully convinced. We're going to talk about some of the strategies and tactics that are used and how to have conversations with these kinds of people about becoming pro-life. So, ladies and gentlemen, I present to you today our guest host, Liliana, Protect Life Michigan.
Thank you. I'm excited to talk with you guys. So my name is Liliana Zylstra. I am the new Director of Marketing at Protect Life Michigan, and we are an organization focused on ending abortion in our state by changing public opinion, like Alex said. So we do that primarily through training and deploying students on college campuses and in communities across our state to have face-to-face conversations with pro-choice people where we show the reality of abortion, and we're able to now change around 34% of the minds of people that we talk to.
34% is a really big number. What does that look like? I mean, you're talking about being director of marketing. What does that look like for you when you're engaging with this organization? Tell us a little bit about how you got involved with that.
Yeah, so my connection to the pro-life movement really starts with Protect Life Michigan. Mm-hmm. I was always pro-life. I was raised to be pro-life. And even from a very young age, I had this passion for justice on the issue of abortion. I had this, this outrage, honestly, as a young child, which I've now learned is actually kind of unusual. But so it grew into this passion for the pro-life movement when I was in high school. I had this passion, but I really didn't have anywhere to direct it. I didn't have anything to do that I saw as meaningful and effective. And then that changed when I learned about Protect Life Michigan. So back when I was in high school, I heard about PLM through social media, actually. I was a homeschooled high school student living here in Grand Rapids, and I heard that they were looking for someone who fit exactly that description to help start a pro-life club. And so I got involved. I got this training in pro-life apologetics. So, the different arguments for and against abortion, the science and philosophy, as well as really just very basic skills for how to have conversations with people who disagree with you. So I was given this training and then had a chance to really engage with real people on this issue and started to see people change their minds. And so that was what brought me into the pro-life movement. I couldn't leave after having that experience as a high school student. And then in college, I came back to Michigan and worked with Protect Life Michigan again over the summer of 2024. I got to be part of this really groundbreaking summer internship that we did. So I can talk more about that later. But it was that experience that really showed me, if we're going to end abortion in our state, if we're going to end the killing of 90 children a day, just in Michigan alone, the way that we're going to do that will be through conversations. Yeah. And I think this is something that anyone can learn to do. You don't have to have a philosophy degree. I think there's two key elements of our approach that make it effective. One is a boldness. We're willing to show people the truth even when it's uncomfortable. We show people the reality of what abortion looks like. We have photographic evidence showing children who were killed by abortion. But we also understand the need to not only have compassion for the people that we talk to, but to show them that we have compassion for them and show them that we have common ground, we have common values, and appeal to those common values as a way to persuade people to be pro-life. And so I think it's that boldness paired with compassion. You might also say just sharing the truth and love. I think that's why we're able to be so effective.
Absolutely. Yeah. This is something that you started doing before college, right? Initially, and then you kind of came back to after school ended, and now you're in a role that's, very deeply enmeshed with this organization. And you said that a big part of what you do was the apologetic side of it, the arguments, and then the other side of it was the direct conversations, right? The actual outreach, the culture change. And I think it makes a lot of sense if you're trying to change policy. And I mean, it sounds so sterile to say policy when you're talking about laws that determine whether or not it is legal to kill a certain person. But de facto, that's what we're talking about, policy. You said to drive policy change, you need to drive cultural change. And I think that absolutely makes sense because the laws of any group of people are going to be reflective of what they think is and isn't morally acceptable. What does it mean to push somebody's moral framework about why this is wrong? And on the other side, you talked about finding that common ground that you can show them what is right. What does that look like? And how do you and the organization you work with handle that kind of thing?
Yeah, a lot of great questions there. I think when we're talking about policy, it's good to remember what our policy is in Michigan and how that's changed recently. Back in, I think it was 2022, we passed Proposal 3, which was voters saying we want abortion as a right in our state constitution. So that was a devastating loss for us. I think it was also helpful because it showed us this is where public opinion is and it's not on our side. And so this is what we need to be laser focused on. And we need to be preparing whenever this issue is on our ballot again so that public opinion is different and people vote differently in the future. As far as what that looks like I said before, we really need to appeal to the values that people already hold. So I'm unlikely to be able to change someone's entire worldview in one conversation. But what I can do is I can talk about human rights and equal rights, something that most people hold as values today. You know, even secular people will value these things. And so really the goal is show someone how the values they already have are inconsistent with abortion. And to be true to those values, they have to be pro-life. So that's always my goal in every conversation is build common ground and then point out the inconsistency in the pro-abortion view.
Yeah, the point you make about common ground is so fascinating because, I mean, we've talked about this a lot on this podcast about the kind of Christian undergirdings of our Western ethics, right? And I mean, drop the Tom Holland kind of buzzwords and whatever and all that stuff. And I mean, it's absolutely true that most of our assumptions are based on like the abstract value of humans, which in like a truly kind of secular framework don't really make a ton of sense. And the fact that those are still present in a way that people are responsive to that is really interesting because the way that your outreach works, you were just saying, like, you can't change somebody's whole moral worldview in this short conversation. And your organization is all about having these conversations, which I think is amazing because too often those conversations don't exist. There's kind of the, like, prepackaged, I am correct on this policy, and then the people who already agree are like, thumbs up. And the people who don't agree are not persuaded by that kind of, because it's not a real argument, right? But what you're talking about is actually going to people and confronting something in the world that they should be appalled by. And we have the moral resources to connect with people on that. And I think that's fascinating. We talk about like Christianity and morality. To what extent is what the work that you do Christian work? And I scare quotes on that because that's like, what does it mean for activism to be Christian or non-Christian? Like, what do you think about that way of asking that question?
Is PLM Christian?
Yeah, well, lots of great questions there, and there's so much I could say about this, but we are motivated by a Christian faith. We are, a Christian organization in that sense. I think for all of us, this is why we do the work that we do and why we're able to do it and continue it in the face of, all of the darkness that we see in the world is faith and trust in God that this is what he wants us to do. And I think there's a number of practical ways that the message of the gospel is very connected to pro-life work. One that I have seen in my experience is that there are opportunities to share the gospel with people when you're talking about abortion. It's certainly not going to be every conversation, but because abortion is such an emotional issue and a very personal issue for many people, people will share a lot of difficult things about their lives. And I think of one man who I talked to in Detroit who was just sharing kind of his whole life story with my friend and I, and a lot of really troubling things that he had gone through. And we sensed this kind of thirst for justice that he had, that he'd never gotten that justice in his life. And we had this sense that he was very hopeless, but looking for hope. And so my friend and I just kind of recognized maybe we're not supposed to talk about abortion right now, because what this man needs to hear is the hope of the gospel, and he needs prayer. And so that's what we shared with him. So I think it's good to be prepared for those conversations. There are going to be moments where you recognize, I came here today to try to save unborn children, to try to talk about abortion, but maybe God had another plan for this conversation. So that's one way in which the gospel is very connected to our work. The other thing, though, looking sort of more long-term, is that, like you said, human rights come from a religious worldview. And like Tom Holland with his book Dominion, I think pointed that out, that even in this secular society, the reason we value human rights is because of Christianity.
Right. Yeah.
So kind of two things with that. My goal in most conversations is to appeal to what people already believe, like I said, to make them pro-life. That's the goal. It's going to be more difficult if I start with, let me change your whole worldview right now.
Right, yeah.
I'm appealing to what we already have in common. But I think that for a lot of people who do become pro-life, there are other changes that can follow. And I've seen this in a number of other pro-life activists from other organizations. One of our former interns has this story. People who were pro-choice atheists, then they become pro-life. Then maybe years down the line, they come to accept Christ as well. And I can't speak for those people and exactly what their experiences are, but I think it makes a lot of sense to me. One thing is just the social aspect. You recognize, these pro-lifers are right about this one thing.
Yeah.
What else are they right about as well?
Right.
But I think it also has a lot to do with this idea of human rights and where does that come from? And I think really the only thing that makes sense is it has to come from a creator.
Yeah, if you're forced to confront that objectively these humans have value that you didn't consider before, it does make sense that the logical next question is, wait a minute, where from?
Absolutely, yes.
And what you're doing, you see as this unfolding, you've said, of the application of the Christian message of justice and the defense of the weak and helpless, right, in society. I think as Christians, we all need to acknowledge that, like, our Christianity is rooted in the gospel, but it goes beyond, right, just sharing the gospel with people. It involves actually living out God's commands and the anthropology of what it means to be human. And that has so many different effects on policy and morality and worldview and things like that. Some Christians take a very narrow lens of what it means to be a Christian witness, to the extent where they would say, you can't change people's minds on things unless you first change their hearts with the gospel. I was thinking that would be an interesting thing just to touch on, saying, no, there is a faithful Christian work in the world that, while it is motivated by and pours out of the gospel, not every conversation is a gospel-specific conversation, even though every conversation is an outflow of what the gospel means. What do you think about gospel engagement in what is, in essence, political activism, right? It's a really interesting question because I think if you take a really strict view and you say, like, this gospel first, kind of like, and only lead with the gospel, what you essentially mean is you can't have any job ever other than evangelist, if you take that to its logical conclusion, I think.
Sure. Yeah, and like we were talking about earlier, I think people are called to different things. Not everyone has to take the same approach. Some people are called to be evangelists, and other people are called to protect the vulnerable. And that comes out of our Christian faith, right? I have a couple of verses here that I think are actually really relevant. James 1:27 says, "Religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this, to look after orphans and widows in their distress and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world." And I think those orphans and widows are really the vulnerable of society. And who is more vulnerable than the unborn? I also think we're called to be wise and be smart about how we act to protect the vulnerable. I also really like Ephesians 5:11-16. It says, have nothing to do with the fruitless deeds of darkness, but rather expose them. It later goes on to say, be very careful then how you live, not as unwise, but as wise, making the most of every opportunity because the days are evil. So that's how I view my pro-life work, is first and foremost rescuing these children, trying to do that in whatever way is most effective and most wise.
Yeah, I think if you went to James and said, like the answer here is the gospel, he would say, well, yeah, but what are you going to do about it, right?
Sure.
Like, what are you going to preach a sermon about, like, Jesus dying on the cross for your sins? Like, that's so important, but the actual, actually living that out means doing things.
Right.
Like literally just supporting these people, giving this money, fighting for this cause. I like the James verse a lot. James is so interesting because James is this. A lot of Protestants struggle with the book of James because it's like, oh, James works. That's rough. That's hard. But I thought it was all about faith. And I think if James were here, he would just shake us and say, the works are your faith in action. This isn't that hard to understand. This isn't that complicated. I think sometimes as evangelicals, we have a somewhat truncated view of what faith means and the actual outflow of faith.
Yeah.
Isn't taken as seriously. You know what I mean? Because faith that hath not works is dead. It's a great piece of doctrine, but if it doesn't do anything, if it doesn't change your heart, if it doesn't actually flow out of you into the world, it's not real.
It's funny how Martin Luther at first was I don't think James should be in the Bible.
That's true. Yeah, that's a bad look for Protestants.
He was tired of being Catholic.
Well, fortunately, everybody else around him told him he was wrong, which is good.
Thankfully,
very good.
He was not infallible, and we know this.
If only we had an infallible guy to tell us what everything was right, and then they turned out to be wrong a lot. All's well with the world again?
25 minutes.
We need a little bit of an equipment upgrade one day, but we'll get there when we get there.
Yeah, if I have money to spend.
If this episode does really well,
maybe
you can.
We got to be more controversial.
That's probably true. That would get you more views.
I'm going to ChatGPT more
how
jokes.
To make controversial.
We need to be more funny. We need to be more controversial. We need to be more hip.
I feel like at that point, what we need to do is replace both of us with other people.
I mean, what you just said could be controversial.
That's true.
To some people.
This is true. I mean, in some ways, the entire Christian message is controversial. So, but I mean, we're obviously not here for the controversy. We're here because we're trying to okay. I was in the middle of a thought.
After the camera stopped, you were talking about faith and works.
Yeah. We were talking about the James verse that you read earlier. And the kind of the works and faith kind of dichotomy. And as evangelicals, we raise that really harshly because we have this very conversionist view of Christianity is probably the best way to say it, where the goal is just to get people to make a conversion decision or to have a conversion experience. And then we're really not as comfortable seeing the fruit of a Christian life as being actually that important. The true religion means the taking care of orphans and widows. There's a reason that a figure like Martin Luther was uncomfortable with that early on during the Protestant Reformation, as he was like, oh, this doesn't sound like the kind of faith lesson that Paul is teaching us in Romans, right? But I think this is where James kind of comes up to us and shakes us a little bit and says, no, that is the output of a living faith. That is the inevitable and necessary output of a living faith, a faith that doesn't want justice, a faith that doesn't want to take care of Christ's body.
It's like getting the linear order correct.
Exactly. And if
works don't go before faith, right?
Exactly, but they necessarily flow out of it.
Yeah.
It's like if Christ is the head of the body, how could we not be his hands giving to people, right? If we're sincere about actually living out what it means to be Christian. And I think going back to what you said, I think the body metaphor is helpful here. People are called to different things as well. I mean, you feel called to pursue a culture change. And that culture change is supposed to result in a policy change. And in that sense, I think the work that we do in every area of our life should be gospel work, not because it is evangelism, but because it's the result of evangelism. I mean, I think I used the example of a prison warden. A prison warden wants to do gospel work. Does he have to convert every prisoner and convert every warden and every guard to being a Christian to set this prison straight? Or does he pursue culture and policy changes? And as part of that, show what a gospel-driven life looks like. And obviously, as part of that, you would want to be telling people, I don't like it when people say, preach the gospel, use words if you have to. We complained about that recently. It was like, no, that's stupid.
Catchphrases.
You should actually talk about it verbally with people. But to the point where if you want to spread the gospel, spreading the results of the gospel, spreading the outflow of the gospel often pulls people towards the heart of that, especially if there's a strong connection between your personal faith and the output that's coming in. I think we briefly mentioned when we were talking earlier, there's some people whose gospel evangelism attitude is more like, get all the stumbling blocks out of the way to make the gospel as inoffensive as possible, because we want people to have the gospel be the only stumbling block as opposed to all of the other cultural and political issues. And maybe there's a place for that. But I think the Christians who are doing Christianity are showing the world what a Christian differentness actually looks like in a way that might be more powerful. Like the way you said, teaching people about the value of life in and of itself, even if it's not an explicitly evangelistic operation, is a gospel work of its own right.
I think you're absolutely right. Yeah, I completely agree.
It's been so interesting to see Americans think through what Christian engagement in politics looks like, because we have the dual instincts of evangelism on one hand, and the kind of Puritan desire to create a public moral good society. And I think inside our minds, there's kind of like this scale, and we're struggling. We want the public square to be moral, but we realize the gospel is at the heart of things. And so we're always having this internal fight of, do we change hearts? Do we change things? And I think the more holistic answer is, you can't have one without the other. You can't spread the gospel without living out the gospel, and you can't live out the gospel without in some way also spreading the gospel. That doesn't mean everything is evangelism, but that also doesn't mean that evangelism is optional. It's kind of it all flows together. It all kind of, one leads to the other, and that leads to that. Change comes from the gospel. The gospel leads to change. Change shows people the gospel. There's this continual unfolding, as opposed to this kind of like conversionist, belief only kind of attitude.
Right. If you're living out the gospel, you will be working to protect the unborn. And once you recognize the value of every human being, the gospel starts to make more sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the other leg of what you were talking about was apologetics. And I think that's an interesting one, because that's one of the things on this podcast that we have always thought is fascinating. What does a pro-life apologetic look like?
Yeah, great question. So typically when I'm talking with someone, I might start by using a human rights argument, which might sound like this. I would ask you, do you believe in human rights? Hopefully you'll say yes, and I'll say, great, glad we agree. How should we determine who gets human rights? Yeah. And you'll probably say everyone should. And my next question would be, since we know biologically from science, if two humans reproduce, they have another human being from conception, and abortion kills that human being, then wouldn't that make abortion a human rights violation?
Have you ever had anybody answer no to whether or not they believe in human rights?
It's definitely happened. Yeah. I think usually when people say that, it's because they know where I'm going with the question and they don't like it.
Interesting.
So they're just trying to mess with you or tease you, or are they just like...
I think that is sometimes the case.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I think most Westerners, because of, at the very least, they're liberal, and I use liberal not as an insult here. I use it as like the big picture. Kind of their liberal, Western, Christian-adjacent heritage are going to answer yes to that question. And, I mean, that drives them down the like a human child is a human and therefore deserves human rights. I think often the response to that is like, oh, there's like backtrack. Well, I can't accept that. So like consciousness is the threshold, right? How do you respond to an objection like that?
Yeah, well, the problem with taking any trait like consciousness or sentience or viability, whatever it is that you're going to end up proving more than you want to. So a great example of that would be the philosopher Peter Singer, who grounds human rights, I think it is, in consciousness. But that means he actually accepts infanticide.
Yeah, which is crazy. I mean, like, if you ask the average American, like, do you think consciousness is part of what makes us human? Like, gives us human rights? Maybe, sure. It's like, so what about unconscious people? And they'd be like, wait, hold on, slow down there. I mean, yeah, you're absolutely right. That's like and it's logical. If you take that stance, Peter Singer's position is logical.
What age?
Absolutely, yeah.
What age would Peter say that you get consciousness? Because it's definitely, I mean, he would say not infants.
Yeah, not infants.
Yeah, definitely after birth. Yeah.
I think I can't remember, but it was like a couple years old. I don't even remember, like, because it's ambiguous when like consciousness develops in kids. It's like a couple years, infanticide.
Yeah.
And obviously we're morally repulsed by that. We don't really know why.
Right.
And I mean, that's where this argument comes in, because we do have that moral instinct.
Right.
You know what I mean?
And you want to use people's moral instincts to help them see how abortion is unjust. And I think as pro-lifers, to us, it's usually very obvious that the key question in the abortion debate is, what is the unborn? Are they a human being like us, or are they not? But we can assume the pro-choice person understands that, and they may not. So the way that I will typically move forward in a conversation is by following a set of steps. Common ground, analogy, question, which is something that Protect Life Michigan learned from our friends at the Canadian Center for Bioethical Reform. They do very similar work to us. So starting with common ground and then using an analogy, typically we will use something called trotting out the toddler. Whatever justification someone gives me for abortion, often, it might be the mother's in poverty. That's a common, objection that people bring up. I'm going to, pause the conversation, say, can I offer an analogy? This is all hypothetical, but imagine we have a mother who's in this dire situation. She's struggling so much, she's going to have to decide, is she going to feed herself or is she going to feed her toddler? Can she kill her toddler, her 2-year-old, to deal with this very difficult situation? And of course, the answer is no, she can't. Yeah. And so then the question is, if she can't kill her toddler for this reason, why could she have killed that same toddler 2 years earlier when he was in the womb?
Yeah. There's this kind of impression that passing through the birth canal somehow magically imbues you with metaphysical value. And that's obviously absurd, right? But I don't think people have been confronted with that question. That all of these same answers they give result in scenarios that they would not be morally okay with.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Largely, common ground, analogy, and then what was the third step?
Question.
Common ground, analogy, question. You're essentially forcing them to defend their moral, reasons for what grounds human value, and then their objections usually involves, some trait or some point in time or something like that. And then you're pushing the consequences of that belief into places where they would be willing to say, oh, you're right, that isn't plausible. Oh, you're right, that isn't plausible.
Exactly. And
you're saying, I think you said 30-something% of conversations, this is something that really gets to people.
Yeah, I think right now the number is 34%.
Wow.
So we track every conversation we have. Most of our outreach conversations are on college campuses in Michigan. We also have our internship program and other outreach events. And over the years, we've kind of fine-tuned our strategy, gotten better and better. I think that 34% number is even going up, which is pretty amazing.
Yeah. Do you think often people just haven't thought through this topic or been confronted by a reasoned pro-life position. Is that just like, I mean, I don't want to say ignorance, but it sounds insulting, but like basically ignorance that they haven't thought this through. They haven't thought through the consequences of this.
Yeah, I think it's definitely, in different people, it can be a combination of ignorance of what abortion does to a child. And so that's part of why we show the reality of abortion using images, and also just not thinking through the logical consequences. And I think it's easy for us as pro-lifers to see why this is wrong, but our culture is so saturated with the pro-abortion message.
Yeah.
I think the abortion industry, they profit off of abortion, and so they want to keep people from understanding what abortion is and pushing these messages on people from a very young age.
Have you guys ever seen the movie Amazing Grace?
John
Yes,
Newton.
with
Yeah.
Wilberforce.
William Wilberforce,
Yeah.
the story of William. I think of it kind of like we're almost in the same situation now, where it's like the culture is very ignorant of everything. So it's like we almost have to be the William Wilberforce and like take people into the slave ships and like show them around and really like open their eyes to see what this really is. So like, how do you do that in your work with PLM? Like, how do you kind of show people what the abortion industry is?
Yeah.
really like?
Well, we take a lot of inspiration from Wilberforce, certainly, and that example of, I think it was bringing people to ships that were used to transport slaves. He basically shocked people into changing their minds about slavery. And so, yeah, one of the things we do at Protect Life Michigan is we use abortion victim imagery, which is something that I didn't always support, if I'm being honest. There was a time, a few years ago when I would have said, I'm worried about this. I think maybe this is a barrier to persuasion because these images are disturbing. They make people uncomfortable. I think as they should, right? And I'd had a few experiences of people, getting angry with me or getting emotional. That was my view for a little while. But I look back on that now, seeing how I was being very self-protective. I didn't want to put myself in an uncomfortable situation, and I didn't want to put myself in a situation where people might dislike me. And I've had a real change in thinking about my role, which is my title might be director of marketing, but marketing is not really the main thing that I'm doing. I'm not just a marketer. I'm a social reformer. And so I'd love for people to like me, but more than that, I want them to hate abortion. That is the goal. And so the way that I view my role has shifted, but the way that I view people's emotional reactions has changed as well. Learning from history was a big part of that. I think Martin Luther King Jr. writes about this idea of social tension in his letter from Birmingham jail. Basically, this idea that there is this tension in society that exists because the injustice is happening. And when he is doing his activism, he's drawing attention to the injustice, that tension is coming out, but he's not causing it. It already existed.
Right.
And so applying that thinking to the issue of abortion, I realized people who see these images, they're probably very uncomfortable because they have this cognitive dissonance trying to understand, on the one hand, I support abortion. I've been told it's a woman's right, but this is what it looks like. And I don't like that. And so people can have these emotional reactions, but it doesn't always mean that there isn't persuasion or mind change taking place. And we have seen actually this is one of, if not the most effective way to change people's minds on this issue.
In talking about that, it makes me think of a few things. The first of which is we would never have people argue that you shouldn't, as part of the education of a modern person, show like Holocaust victim imagery, right? You would never say, oh, that's disturbing, that bothers people. It's like, yeah, it should. Like, that's the point. Because it is a disturbing thing. You're being disturbed is a good reaction. It's an unpleasant reaction, but it is a good reaction. On the other hand of thinking through that, you're talking about like showing people the truth, confronting people with the truth of something. There's disgust, disturbance. I think we underestimate the value of disgust as a genuine moral response to something being evil. I think we should be disturbed and we should be disgusted. And we tend to sanitize what it means to be moral. It's like almost like good feelings equals good. If you have good feelings equals good. Well, if there's something evil, maybe you shouldn't be feeling good feelings right now. Like maybe you should be feeling bad feelings. Maybe you should be outraged, disgusted, disturbed. Maybe your moral world should be given a bit of a shove because reality confronts you with things that are evil. And I don't think a being that is created in the image of God, first of all, should be able to be comfortable with this kind of evil. And I think fundamentally isn't. I think morality in the world that we live in is something that is going to disturb us because, like I said, we live in a disturbing world. And because in the West we are very addicted to comfort and to comfortable things, I think that's one of our great weaknesses, that we don't see the value of things like disgust and even anger as being genuine, good moral sentiments. We like being comfortable. I like being comfortable. But maybe I shouldn't be in many of the situations that I deal with. On the topic of apologetics, the most famous argument, as the sophisticated pro-choice argument, is the violinist argument. And
what's that?
Yeah. Do you want to set up the premise of that and how you would talk through that one?
Sure. So the violinist argument is, I think, known as one of the best pro-abortion arguments. It was developed by a philosopher named Judith Jarvis Thomson. It's interesting. What she does is she acknowledges, at least for the sake of argument, that the unborn child is a human person, and says, even so, abortion can be justified. She does this with this hypothetical thought experiment about this world-famous violinist who has a fatal kidney ailment. And what happens is that this violinist has a big fan club, the Society of Music Lovers. They're very devoted to keeping him alive, and they somehow access a bunch of medical records, and they discover that you are the only person with the correct blood type to save this violinist. So they come and they kidnap you in the middle of the night. They hook up your circulatory system to this violinist, and they determine somehow that all you need to do is stay in bed hooked up to this violinist for 9 months, and then you can safely unplug. Both of you will survive. But if you unplug from him before those 9 months are over, then he's going to die of his kidney disease. And Thompson says, we all would recognize it would be a good moral thing for you to do to help save this violinist, but we can't really legally obligate you to really give your body to save him, right? And I think she's right. And so it's a very scary argument in that sense, I think. But there's a fatal flaw, which is this scenario is not analogous to pregnancy in the morally relevant ways. And we can see this if we just simply ask, what will this violinist die of? If you unplug from him and he dies, he's dying of his kidney disease, right? Because it's different from pregnancy. In a pregnancy, you don't have the option to just withhold support. Yeah. Having an abortion is not withholding support. It's actually directly killing the unborn child. And so the scenario that would be analogous to an abortion is, let's say, you want to unplug from this violinist, and for some reason you're prevented from doing it while he's alive. So you have to actually kill him in order to detach from him, and you find some medical tool in your hospital room and you actually directly stab him to death. That would be what an abortion does. So the argument is very fancy, very interesting, but ultimately it's not powerful at all.
Yeah, it's only an analogy, first of all, if you don't distinguish between withholding artificial support and actively ending somebody's life. Right. And I mean, we make distinctions between those things all the time. Like we have somebody in a coma or on life support. I mean, we have people who we remove from life support. We stop artificially supporting them. We don't end their lives. Euthanasia is not legal in the United States, to the best of my knowledge.
I believe in
Maybe there's
some
a few states.
I think there's a few states, unfortunately.
Except for those states. Broadly speaking, it's probably, I don't think it's legal in most states, but we acknowledge that there is a difference between those things. And I mean, in a lot of different laws and courts, that it makes sense that destroying someone and withdrawing artificial life support are totally different scenarios.
Right.
There's also like parenthood has moral obligations internal to it, I think, in a way that you and a random violinist wouldn't have. I think it's not just you don't have a right to X. I think, and this might not be a good argument to use on somebody who's like doesn't agree with you, but like from a Christian perspective, we have an ethic of obligation, not just of this is a wall you can't cross over somebody's rights. As a Christian, we actually do believe that there are moral obligations to help people, like especially connected to God, like the love your neighbor as yourself is actually positive law. It's not like negative law. And I think in the secular world, most of what we use is negative law, like you're not allowed to cross this line or this line. I think there's another analogical difference because motherhood and random violinist is just a totally different kind of relationship.
Right. And
intrinsically.
And that's the reason that there is no option as a pregnant mother to just withhold support. It's that biologically, your child is developing in your womb, and if you don't want that to happen, the only thing you could do is to kill that child. You can't withhold support. And so it's that biological, natural relationship you have, which is the reason that morally this is a very different scenario than the violinist.
Absolutely.
So tell us a little bit about what deep canvassing is, because I think that's one of your guys's, like one of your strategies. And then tell me a story about a time that you guys used deep canvassing. I think it was in one of your internships and things like that. So tell us more about that.
Yeah, so deep canvassing is really interesting. I actually first learned about this reading a book called How Minds Change by David McRaney. It's all about the psychology of persuasion and how people change their minds. And he started writing about deep canvassing and the history behind it, which is it was actually developed by a gay rights organization in California. I think it was 2008. California voted against gay marriage. So this organization was trying to kind of figure out where to go from there and how to change the culture on that issue. And they developed this strategy called deep canvassing. And what made it different from traditional political canvassing is that they were going door to door after they'd already lost the election, and they were asking people, help me understand how you think about this issue. How, what emotions come up for you? What personal life experiences do you have that have shaped your view of whatever this controversial issue is? And then this tactic has been used by various different groups on the left for different issues. Some pro-abortion groups have used this. So as I'm reading this book and hearing about this, I'm kind of seeing why it's so effective.
Yeah, you're connecting with people on a really,
exactly.
really deep level that gets you a lot more, I don't want to say, in some sense, emotional engagement and leverage than the usual, like, here are my points.
Right. And I think this is one example of how the left generally, has been very persuasive and changed the culture in a lot of ways. So reading this, I'm thinking, like, how do we tweak this and use it for our purposes in the pro-life movement? But at the time, this was a couple of years ago, no one in the pro-life movement really knew what this was. So I didn't think I would ever get to take part in deep canvassing. But a couple months after I first learned about it, I found out that Protect Life Michigan was testing this out. It was part of our Operation Zero summer internship, which is a persuasion campaign that we've done for the past 2 summers. It's really a way to focus in on a particular community and flood them with the pro-life message over a variety of different media channels. And so one of those ways that we communicate with people is through going door to door, deep canvassing. And so we've kind of figured out, how do we take this strategy and use it for the pro-life side? And what that looks like typically is that I will start conversations by asking people about their view on abortion. And then I'll ask them, how do you feel about this issue? What feelings come up for you when you talk about abortion? And what life experiences have shaped your views? And it may seem a bit, I guess, counterintuitive because I don't want to stay in that place of just talking about emotions and experiences. But I found it to be very helpful, one, just as a way to build trust with people by showing I'm willing to listen to you. I actually care about you as a unique individual person. In the pro-life movement, one of our biggest challenges is a lack of trust, because we can have all the right answers, all the right arguments, but if the other side doesn't trust who we are as people, they're not going to listen to us. And often those things that are barriers to persuasion are related to issues of identity. People who, to them, being pro-choice is the smart, kind, caring thing to do. And their idea of what pro-lifers are is the total opposite of that. Mm-hmm. So demonstrating that belief to be false by just being, a caring pro-life person can go a really long way. But the other thing that this does is it helps people understand their own views. I think a lot of people would like to believe that all the positions they have for logical reasons.
Yeah.
But often it is an emotion or a life experience that is the real motivation behind a belief. And so if I can ask someone a question that helps them understand that better, I can help them, challenge their own views themselves.
There's an author on ethics named Jonathan Haidt who talks about different moral foundations. And he says our morality is far more intuitive than it is rational. And what you're saying totally gels with that. Mm-hmm. People have an intuitive answer for why they think something is right. And then they make up post hoc logical justifications for why they believe it.
Is Jonathan Haidt a Christian?
He's not.
Okay.
He's an atheist. No. But he has a very broad view of morality. I think along the lines of what you said as well, I think it is absolutely true that liberals, and he points this out, have monopolized the fairness and empathy moral constructs as being liberals are fair and empathetic. Therefore, if you want to be a fair and empathetic person, you have to be on that team and hold their policy positions, even if you haven't actually rationally justified them. So I think it makes a ton of sense what you're talking about. If you actually want to change somebody, you need to challenge their intuitions and you need to challenge their logical arguments, which are often the fallbacks. Once their intuitions are challenged, you try to rationalize your previously held position. And then it's well, actually, that can't be rationally defended very well. So it makes so much sense the way that you're talking about it. And also along that line, this is something Jonathan Haidt talks about. He had a disgust sanctity conception of moral foundation. And I think as Christians, we really need to think more about that, because in the Old Testament, sanctity and cleanness is hugely linked. And I think when we're talking about the outrage and the disgust at evil, and we talked about victim imagery, I think that is moral. I don't think it is just reactive. I think it is a moral dimension, and confronting people with a moral dimension that they're uncomfortable with, it strengthens this overall framework of being able to say, first of all, your empathy is in the wrong place. Your fairness is in the wrong place. You think you're being fair and empathetic with your position, but are you really? And then the ability to show that sanctity is an important part of this, the sanctity of the human life, and that the disgust at a desecration of sanctity is really a part of this, is really fascinating in light of what I've been learning about that recently. And it makes a ton of sense why deep canvassing is strategically so meaningful.
Yeah, it's interesting you brought up Jonathan Haidt, because I was actually talking with someone recently about his moral foundations. I believe there are 6 or 7.
Yeah, something like that.
And despite, I think, being more liberal himself, he has argued that conservatives are the only group that truly embodies all of the moral foundations. Liberals only embody 3 of them. So I think that's, very interesting.
It is. I think what you can do strategically, and what you have been doing, maybe without necessarily naming it, is being able to leverage all of those moral frameworks to actually show why what you're trying to do is something not only that is true, but that people can connect with.
Right. We need our position to acknowledge all of the moral foundations, but then we need to show how it does that.
Yes.
And deep canvassing, as well as victim imagery, are very powerful ways to do that.
What are the different moral frameworks?
Oh, gosh. I need to look it up.
I don't remember.
I'm listening to
either.
the audiobook,
right now.
and that means I don't have any of the diagrams.
Yeah, I was actually talking with my little brother about this.
Really?
Yeah.
That's crazy.
He was working on an article about Nick Fuentes and like all of those people and how they're like taking the moral foundations that the left doesn't acknowledge, but only so they're not really conservative because they don't have all of them.
Right.
Something like that.
That's fast. I would love to see research about that. It's so funny. I'm literally on the last chapter of his audiobook.
That's very cool.
Jonathan Haidt and his colleagues propose that human beings have 6 different areas of moral concern: care, fairness, liberty, loyalty, authority, and purity. So which ones, like the liberals, are only focused on?
Care, fairness, and liberty.
Those first 3.
Yeah. Whereas loyalty, authority, and purity are really not important in a liberal moral framework.
Mm-hmm.
But conservatives actually have, and this is something that like they did surveys on, where they asked people how much they care about these things. And it's like all 6 are on like the same level. Whereas for liberals, it's like way slanted towards the other side. And like authority, loyalty, and purity are like completely denigrated in their worldview.
So like authority is not important at all?
No.
Not really. Or not as important. Yeah.
Or at least not a priority in their moral thinking, which I found fascinating.
Have you read The Righteous Mind?
That's the audiobook that I'm currently listening to.
Oh, so that's okay. Yeah. I've not read it, but I've heard about it a little bit.
It's really interesting. The first half is like superb. And he's talking about like the way that we tend to justify ourselves, the different moral frameworks and things. The second half, he basically argues that all of morality is an evolutionary adaptation. And it's kind of like, I like the first half better.
What do you expect? I mean, so as we are coming to a close, what are some ways that maybe Christians could be involved? Maybe there's some people listening to this podcast. They're like, I want to be involved more into the pro-life organization, activism. How should they get involved?
Yeah, well, there are a few ways. I think one thing that every Christian can do is just learn the pro-life worldview and how to talk about it and how to engage with people who disagree. Whatever your circle of influence is or your community, even if most of the people you know are Christian, I think you might be surprised how a lot of Christians either are pro-choice or just really aren't sure what they believe about abortion. And so I think we need more voices to speak up for the unborn and be able to do that both by, making a logical case against abortion and presenting it in a compassionate way. So I would encourage people read up on this issue. I think a great place to start would be our online dialogue training. You can go to protectlifemi.org and watch all the same training that we use for our students. If you want to get really into the philosophy, I would recommend a book called The Case for Life by Scott Klusendorf. Just an excellent book, and you'll be very prepared if you read that for any conversation on this issue. And as far as how to get involved with Protect Life Michigan specifically, there's a number of ways that you can do that. You can sign up as a financial partner. You can join outreach at a college campus near you. And if you're a student, you can join our summer internship program, which we're going to be in Ann Arbor this upcoming summer. I think the applications do close December 31st, so I would apply soon.
Edit quickly.
Better get on that.
Yes.
I will.
And, if you don't live you can sign up for our internship even if you don't live in Michigan. But if you're interested in taking the strategies that we use and putting them into practice in another state or another city outside of Michigan, reach out to us through our website, and we would love to help you get that started.
Awesome. Yeah, we're going to put links and some information in the description. Thank you for being here. We really appreciate it. Learn more. Look into it. Do your research. And thank you for joining us today on Disruption.
Catch you on the flip side.
Stay safe out there, folks.
Thank you for listening to the Disruption podcast, where we aim to disrupt culture and center Christ. If you like this episode, be sure to leave a like on this video and add a comment to add to our discussion, and subscribe so that you don't miss any of our future episodes. We'll see you on the next one.